morning, everybody. Welcome to this SAM briefing on marijuana and opioids. My name is Kevin Sabet. I'm the president, CEO, and co-founder of SAM. I've met many of you in the past before. A little bit of my background: I was a senior policy advisor in the Obama administration for 2.5 years. Helped with Keith Humphreys, who we're very excited to be here, co-write the president's first national drug control strategy. Before that, served in the Bush administration for about a year, and also the Clinton administration for a short time. My background is in public policy. I'm an affiliated fellow also at Yale University, and we're just very excited to put this on today because this is one of the most misunderstood issues, I think, right now with regards to marijuana. We have a twin epidemic right now of opioids and marijuana. There are more heavy marijuana users now than there have been in over 40 years, and probably even more since then because our data have gotten better since then. But at the same time, we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic that started with prescription drugs and is now into the fentanyls and synthetics. Those two epidemics are inextricably tied, and not in a good way, unfortunately, but in a negative way. We're going to talk a little bit about that. For those of you that don't know a lot about SAM, when I left the administration in 2011, I could see the writing on the wall that the move to normalize, commercialize, and legitimize marijuana was not driven by social justice concerns by the people who were actually funding the movement, but actually by commercial concerns. There was a new industry similar to the tobacco industry, similar to pharma and the alcohol industry, that was looking for one thing and one thing only, and that was to make money, like any industry, to profit. And that they would do that at the expense of science, that they would do that at the expense of public health, public safety, and common sense. And that's when former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and I, as well as the Bush speechwriter David Frum, formed the first bipartisan marijuana policy organization in the country, SAM. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We get all of our funding from individual donors and small foundations with no ties to any industry. And we promote an evidence-based approach to marijuana policy. We don't want to see people locked up in prison for small amounts of marijuana. We do not want to see private prisons. We do not want to see people imprisoned, and given a sentence which is going to hurt their entire life, or arrested needlessly. But on the other hand, we don't think the answer to that is to do what we're doing in several states, which is to commercialize the sales of marijuana. We are proud to have a science advisory board. One of our advisory board members, Dr. Christine Miller, is here with us in the audience, and our advisory board spans the country and from Harvard University to multiple other universities. We've collaborated with multiple organizations in the past, all the top medical associations, business groups, leading public health authorities, and we have about 36 affiliates around the country. We do this because we really are trying to sound the alarm of this growing industry that has turned a low THC product, naturally low marijuana THC product, into a hyper-industrialized, 99% THC in some instances, edibles, candies, cookies, sodas, and turned in, something that may have been 5% THC in Woodstock days to an average, DEA tells us average marijuana sees about 13% now, except on the legal market, you're up to 99.9%, and we're very concerned about that. Like I said, we don't subscribe to the dichotomy that it's either prison or legalization. We think there are smarter policies that are connected to treatment, brief interventions, early prevention, diversion programs, drug courts, health probation, on and on and on, multiple things that are much better to be focusing our time on than to be thinking about legalization. And then finally, before I go to the next speaker, or our first speaker, I should say, we also want to make sure that these three issues of decriminalization, the proper medical use of marijuana and its compounds, and legalization really stay distinct. We should not merge these issues together. We absolutely agree with FDA-approved medications derived from marijuana. We not only agree with them, we have been pushing Congress to make really sensible changes to researching marijuana and Schedule I drugs. Some of those recommendations, thankfully, have been adopted, others haven't. But we are pushing for basically doing medication the right way. Medication, as you all know, is not a popularity contest. It's not a democratic vote. It's a scientific process. It's not a vote to the people. It's what happens in the scientific process determines what safe and effective medicines are. And so the recent announcement of Epidiolex as a Schedule 5 drug to be dispensed in pharmacies by legitimate physicians is a good thing. We want to see more of those marijuana-based medications that could actually help people. That, though, is a very different issue than the normalization and legitimization of raw marijuana, high THC marijuana, for clearly non-medical purposes. And so we want to make sure those issues are separate. We also want to make sure the issue of decriminalization and the removal of criminal penalties is separate. A reason to legalize marijuana is not because of the criminal aspect. You can deal with the criminalization aspect. Many states have. They've adopted things where it's not a criminal penalty, but instead there's an assessment to see if you have a problem. There's a referral to treatment if needed, and you don't get a stain on your record. You're not discriminated against for housing and healthcare and college loans. That is important, but that is the kind of conversation we should be having as opposed to mixing all of these things together. So I'm going to come up again at the end and talk about some of the data, but I wanted to do some quick intros of our speakers here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. We'll put up Dr. This is the order too. Yeah. Great. Put up Dr. Clark first. So Dr. Kelly Clark is the president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. She's certified in both addiction medicine and psychiatry. ASAM is the largest group of physicians specializing in addiction in the country. They have over 6,200 addiction professionals. Dr. Clark also founded Addictions Crisis Solutions to provide both consulting and education of all stakeholder groups in the service of transforming addiction care into evidence-based practice. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Keith Humphreys. Keith and I were, like I said, together at ONDCP. It was a real privilege and pleasure to learn from him while I was there. We're very happy that he's traveled all the way over here from Stanford. He's the Esther Ting Memorial Professor at Stanford University. And as I said, he spent a sabbatical at ONDCP for 1 year and has been really focused on both the marijuana issue and the opioid issue. Also done a lot of work in the VA population, which is something we hear a lot about with regards to opioids. So we're really excited that he's here. We're also very excited to have Dr. Joseph Garbely, who's the Vice President of Medical Services, the Medical Director at Caron Treatment. Many of you know Caron Treatment Centers, which is one of the most prestigious treatment organizations in the country. Dr. Garbely has an extensive background in treating addicted individuals, including healthcare professionals, executives, and pilots who suffer from substance use disorders. And there's so much we can learn about those special, what they call physician health programs, for example. When you have someone in those high positions where public health and public safety really do matter, how do you treat that population? We actually know the medical profession is one of the highest professions of addiction in the country, amazingly enough, mainly because of easy access to addictive medications. And what Dr. Garbely does to work with them and to give them incentives to get off, but also get them back on track is pretty incredible. And I would urge you to look into physician health programs. We're also really privileged to have former Deputy Drug Czar, Dr. Bertha Madras here, who is a professor of psychobiology at Harvard Medical School and directs the Laboratory of Addiction at McLean Hospital, along with MGH, Mass General. Dr. Madras has worked very closely with the WHO, World Health Organization, and the UN. She was also one of 6 members of President Trump's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis in 2017, which also our co-founder Patrick Kennedy served on. She's worked very closely with Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker and others, and right now her lab is exploring whether adolescent and adult primate brains respond differently to cannabinoids found in the marijuana plant. And that's very important because, as she'll tell you, marijuana is such a complex plant, much more complex than the opium poppy. And in the marijuana plant there are hundreds of components, most of which we have no idea about. And it's very important to really separate science from fiction with regards to cannabinoids, because you have commercial interests who are making all kinds of claims way before the science. And so we're here today to kind of separate myth from fact. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Clark.
Good morning. Well, before we start our discussion today about addiction and substance use and substance abuse, I think it's helpful to define a few terms. So let's start with that. Substance use, which is taking a substance for a desired purpose. Your morning coffee is an excellent example of substance use. A substance use disorder, which is a psychiatric diagnosis, means, among other things, that a person's substance use is to a point where they're having subjective distress about it, or they're having some objective kind of problem because of that use and can't stop. Addiction, we think of as a chronic brain disease. Okay? It's a disease that hits specific parts of the brain around reward and motivation, memory, and related circuitry. You're going to be hearing a lot more about science later in our panel here. But from the outside, what addiction looks like, instead of on scans and on autopsy. On the outside, it looks like people lose control of their drug use. And then they've lost control of their lives because of their drug use. That's how we see addiction on the outside. So what puts people at risk for addiction? I'm starting very high level. We're going to end up at the most granular scientific information that you'd want. About half of the risk, up to half of the risk, is genetic. Okay, people have a biological predisposition toward an addictive disease. But they're not going to develop that addictive disease unless their brain is exposed to the substance. Okay, so we know that the younger the brain at the first exposure, the higher the risk of addiction. Repeated exposures of the brain to a substance increases the risk of addiction. And the use of one drug increases the risk of use of and addiction to other drugs. Kind of makes sense, right? Thank you for nodding. I like to make sense. One of my many quirks. Okay, so what contributes to people choosing to put their brain at risk and use the substance? What contributes to them exposing their brain? Well, the higher availability of a substance increases its risk of use. The use of one drug, again, will increase the risk of use of another. And then the lower the perception of the risk of that use, the higher the risk of use. So we saw this with opioids, right? Opioids are safe. Doctors prescribe them. We see this with ODE cigarettes, the Juul products for the youth, right? Oh, they're safe. Okay? They're safe. They're accessible. They deliver drug at a young age. All of these things we know predispose to the development of addiction. So is cannabis addicting? Here's an easy one. Yes. Yes. Very similar to other recreational drugs. Nicotine and alcohol. Do we ask if those things are addicting? And we know they are. Very similar to prescribed drugs like opioid analgesics or pain medicines or sedatives. We know that these substances are addicting. The key is that most people who use these substances don't develop addiction. That doesn't mean the substance isn't addicting. Right? Very key. But far too many people who use these substances become addicted. And even those who are not addicted, far too many of them suffer adverse effects of their drug use. So when we think about cannabis, we think, are there positive health impacts of this? Like with opioid analgesics, there are positives when we use opioids at times, or are there only negative? Like alcohol, there is no safe level, there is no healthy level of alcohol use. Or smoking, nicotine. 1 in every 20 cancers in this country are related to alcohol intake. More people die from nicotine, from smoking, and more people die from alcohol independently than die from opioids. So simply because most people who use don't get addicted does not mean a substance is not addicting, and it doesn't mean that there aren't substantial, tremendous health impacts from the legal and prescribed drugs we have. Okay, how prevalent is this? 1 in 11 Americans 12 or older used cannabis in the past month. Think about that. That means from 13-year-olds to 93-year-olds, 1 in 11 used cannabis in the past month. Only 1 out of 67 Americans have a cannabis use disorder only. That makes us about 4 million people who have a problem with cannabis. Okay, how are we going to deal with preventing opioid addiction? Well, we can't change your genetics. We can work to educate and ensure the following. Increase the age of the brain at the time of first exposure. Decrease repeated brain exposures. Decrease the use of all drugs. Decrease the availability of the substance, any substance, and educate on the true risks of all drug use. This means opioids, and this means cannabis. So let's talk about medication. Okay, what is a medication? Well, in the United States Food and Drug Administration is responsible to ensure the safety and efficacy. Does it work? Is it safe? Let's look at the risk-benefit analysis. When determining which substances are allowed to be marketed as medications. Now, we have 3 medications that are FDA approved to treat opioid use disorder. 3, only 3. We have methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. We have rescue medication for overdose, which is naloxone. We have a medication that's approved for withdrawal, lofexidine. But we have 3 medications that are FDA approved. Risk-benefit analysis are very clear on these 3 medications to treat opioid use disorder. And how do they make that risk-benefit analysis? Well, the FDA ensures that. We highlight the risks, we highlight the side effects. Their medications are tested. There's a consistency in FDA-approved medication products. That consistency is out there for quality assurance. You've heard about drug recalls, medication recalls, right? This is part of our FDA process of ensuring safety of our medication supply. And there's post-marketing surveillance that happens after a medication comes to market to ensure safety continues. As risks, as side effects become noted, that those are monitored. This is part of what a medication is in the U.S. But we've taken a very different approach to cannabis in this country. Cannabis is not held to the same standards as medications. 2 exceptions, and Dr. Sabet mentioned one, Epidiolex, and the other is Marinol. Those are FDA-approved products that came from cannabis. And they go through that process. But otherwise, there is no medical marijuana. We don't smoke medications in this country, and we don't eat them in foodstuffs. That process of medication safety and effectiveness we've gone through for 2 and only 2 products related to cannabis. And then in terms of recreational drug use, we don't hold cannabis to the same standards as nicotine or alcohol in this country, even in the states that have determined that they will make cannabis legal. So if, for alcohol, you can tell how much alcohol is within any product. We're very clear that these substances of nicotine and alcohol should not be marketed to youth, etc. We're not holding cannabis to this same standard. So we do have 3 medications, and you'll hear about this a bit later as well, that are FDA approved to treat opioid use disorder. These medications have been proven to do a couple things. First of all, save lives. People who are on, we've got substantial data, who are on these medications have half of the risk of dying from their opioid addiction while they're taking those medications as people who don't take the medications. Clear data that these medications are keeping people alive. We know that they're clinically effective, we know that they're cost effective. Okay? And doctors, we understand the risks and benefits of these medications. We can look at studies that were done and determine, I'm not choosing methadone because this person has a lengthening of their, how long it takes the electrical impulse to go through the heart. We know through the FDA process what side effects and risks are, and so we can manage these appropriately. We're not using these medications in this country. Most treatment programs in the U.S. do not utilize these medications. In fact, only about 40% of the treatment programs in this country are utilizing these medications that have been proven to help, proven to be effective and safe treatment. So why do we look at unproven, untried, addictive substances like cannabis when we can simply focus on increasing access to what we know works for treatment? As we go forward, let's do the simple thing. Let's look at the data. Let's not look at one or two cases. Let's not look at anecdotal data. We have a panel of scientists here. Look at what works. Look at how we treat every medicine, how we treat every recreational drug, and do that with cannabis. The simple answer to a complex problem is never going to be appropriate. It will always have adverse consequences. And cannabis is not the answer to our opioid epidemic.
Dr. Humphreys.
Hi, how you doing? It's nice to be here. I'm going to talk about medical cannabis pain and opioid overdoses, things we're all very interested in. Okay, so let's start with the studies that we have. You've probably seen these studies because they've gotten a lot of press. There's a number of studies showing that in states that have legalized medical cannabis, subsequently the rate at which people overdose on opioids seems lower than we would have expected. There's also some other ones showing that people seem to use less medications. There's even one study saying there's a big drop in alcohol consumption. So what does that mean? What does that mean about states? What does it mean about the interaction of different drugs? So some people think it means this. The best, smartest thing we could do is to expand medical cannabis all over, and then that would not eliminate it, but greatly reduce our opioid overdoses. So this slide is why scientists are no fun at parties. What I want to believe and what I do believe are different. That's one of the things about being a scientist. So I've spent my whole career, 30 years, trying to help people who are addicted. I talk to families all the time, and they're just going out of their minds that somebody they love is addicted to opioids. I really, really want this to be true, desperately want it to be true. The thing about the science is that lots of things we want to be true turn out not to be true, and that's why we have to do really good research so we can separate out what we wish for and what is actually the case. And there's a history here that's worth knowing. This is an ad for restorative wine of coca. It comes from about 100 years ago. It's to tell you how various drugs were introduced. It's sort of interesting history. Morphine was originally introduced because it was going to cure alcoholism, as they called it. Cocaine was then popularized because it was going to cure morphine addiction and alcoholism. Subsequent to that, heroin was introduced, claiming that it would cure alcoholism, morphine addiction, cocaine addiction. And this, if you read the fine print here, this basically cures everything, certainly all other addictions. So we've done this before. In the early days of medicine, we thought a new addictive drug is going to drive out an old addictive drug. And generally what's happening is then we get people addicted to the new addictive drug and they're still addicted to it. That's why we do research, because of this history. So let's think about this critically. How could this be, what is a causal model that can explain why more medical cannabis might reduce opioid? There's different ones you can use, but this is the most commonly invoked, and the one that actually seems most plausible, is that as people with pain conditions consume medical cannabis, then they get pain relief, and that leads them to consume less opioids, and maybe makes them drink less, and maybe makes them take less antidepressants and anxiolytics. That's the idea. So if that's true, if that's what these studies are proving, then three things have to be true. First, that something in this plant reduces pain. Second, that aggregate relationships have to be replicated in individuals. In other words, when states correlate on something, the people in those states have to correlate on the same thing. And the last, since these are correlational studies, the correlations prove causality. So I'm just going to go through each one of these. I'll start with the first one. Does the cannabis plant reduce pain? Yeah, there is some evidence on that. The cannabinoid receptor system, probably evolutionarily, is the oldest one in the body, or one of the oldest. It's distributed, it's not just in the brain, it's through the body. It seems to have some role in pain regulation, which we do not understand very well. But there is one review that looks at 27 trials and says there's at least low-strength evidence that cannabis helps on neuropathic pain. A more recent review that just came out is more negative. But it's certainly plausible, and it's definitely worth checking out further. So we should be studying that more. Maybe it's true. I'll talk at the end about maybe some ways we could have more of that research. We definitely need it. But I point out that even if this is true, you wouldn't expect it to change the opioid epidemic very much, because there's already over 100 non-opioid medications that affect pain. So it's unlikely that the 101st would then lead to a big change. So the second thing is aggregate relationships have to be replicated in individuals. When Colorado does something, then you can assume that about everybody in Colorado. So I'm going to show this through, this is a real example of baseball. So on your left, David Justice, much admired because he's Halle Berry. Also played sports. On your right, Derek Jeter, played for the Yankees. So evil, but good hitter. Okay, this is real data. Okay, this is their an example of aggregation. So this is their real batting averages for 3 years in a row. And as you can see, David Justice has a higher batting average in each individual season. You see, this is real. So then the question is, so who had the best average overall across those 3 seasons? The answer is Derek Jeter. This is not some underhanded trick. This is math. And the reason that's true is something we often forget in aggregation is the seasons where Derek Jeter hit really well, he had a lot more at-bats. And so when you add everything up, it turns out that he's actually better in the aggregate. He's a better hitter than Dave Justice, even though every individual season was worse. And that's called an ecological fallacy. And these are very well known in epidemiology. What it means is plenty of things correlate in the aggregate that don't correlate at the individual level, and sometimes the actual correlations go the other way. So here, I mean, there's many of these very famous. Here's some of my favorite ones. The middle one is, the regions in France with the highest rates of smoking have the lowest rates of esophageal cancer. Okay, that doesn't prove that smoking cures cancer. The counties in the United States with the highest level of radon exposure have the lowest level of lung cancer. Again, it doesn't prove that an individual who's exposed to radon is less likely to get lung cancer. And this is pretty much taught in every epidemiology class, probably the first course they would teach you this thing, but we've overlooked it in this literature. The last thing is that correlations have to reflect a causal relationship. In other words, lots of things correlate because they're cause. And I just say about that, you have to say correlations either prove cause or they don't. It is true in the states with medical cannabis, we have a correlation showing negative towards opioid overdose. But there's a lot of other correlations in the literature too. People who use medical cannabis, in addition to opioids, use more opioids than those who don't. We know that medical cannabis users use more prescriptions and misuse more prescriptions than non-users. We know that over time, people who are interviewed who are using cannabis 10 years and 10 years later are more likely to be having an opioid problem. Those are all correlations too. So if you're going to dismiss these 3, then you have to dismiss that one, and vice versa. And so, yeah, this is a science thing. You just got to be logically consistent. We can't say, well, that correlation supports what I want to be true, so I'm going to say that's proof of cause. This one doesn't, so I'm not going to say that's just a correlation. It's all correlation. Okay, so here we are. And these 3 things that have to be true. Something the cannabis plant has to reduce pain. Probably true, or at least maybe true. Aggregate relationships have to be replicated in individuals, definitely not true. Correlations have to produce cause. You really have to go all in on that one way or the other. And if you do, you get in this weird situation where say cannabis both causes and stops opioids. So here's what the editors of Addiction said, of which I am one, but this was signed by all the editors. This is the most read addiction journal in the world. All human beings are susceptible to confirmatory bias. We are inclined to uncritically accept evidence that accords with our pre-existing beliefs. A good example is the preparedness of some researchers to accept weak evidence that increased access to medical cannabis in the USA has reduced opioid overdose deaths in that country. This is where the head and the heart don't line up together, and so we go with the head with this in science. So we don't really know the answer to this question. We should stop acting like we do, and we should try to figure out more. And there's good ways to do that. First off, you should treat it like any other medical problem. You approach it at equipoise. In other words, your job when you study something is not to say, I'm going to prove what I've always wanted to be true is true. Instead, you're going to test what you think might be true. If it's wrong, you just let the chips fall where they may. We could change how drugs are scheduled. I think this is actually, at least one congressperson proposed this. I wrote about this in the Washington Post. We could have a schedule called 1R for drugs that are in Schedule 1 that we think might have medical utility. And we could say for medical research, they're down-scheduled. They're much easier to get because it's a real pain to try to get cannabis to do research. The last thing is, Congress actually approved more people to do medical research farms. And a lot of people apply to do it, and none of them, those licenses have been granted. You could let that happen, let more people do it. It seems to me as a state, if you're allowed to run a medical marijuana system where you give out medical marijuana, you ought to be able to study whether or not it's working. We could do that and we would learn more. And in the meantime, it's not that we don't have good things to do about the opioid epidemic. We have lots of good things to do. In fact, there's a number of good things in the bill that Congress just passed. But here's some ideas. Plus, we've got Dr. Madras here. You can look in the commission report on addiction. Also, at the end of 2016, there's a Surgeon General report on addiction health. We know smart things to do, and that they actually just articulated very well. So it's not as if we're helpless towards this problem. We just need to do things that have evidence behind them. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Garbely.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. There's going to be a common theme running through all of these talks. We independently made our own talks up and had different questions that we were asked to answer. But you can see through all the talks, there's a common theme, and you'll see that common theme in mine. I was asked to answer the question, is marijuana effective for treating opioid use disorder? So this is a downstream, fully codified substance use disorder. And is marijuana effective in treating it? That's the question that I need to answer. But before I do that, let's talk about the chronic disease that is addiction. As you can see up there, addiction is a chronic disease, just like diabetes, hypertension, and asthma. It's a chronic disease that's relapsing and remitting, just like those other chronic diseases. And just like those other chronic diseases, we employ medication treatment, we employ behavioral modifications and psychosocial therapy to help people achieve remission. And what's at stake here is a lot. Last year, according to the CDC, 72,000 people died of overdose. 2/3 of those people died of an overdose related to opioids. And you can see the phases that we have moved through in this disease, or in this epidemic, I should say. Initially, it was a prescription opioid epidemic. And right now, this year, we're at a 10-year low of opioid prescribing. We still have a long way to go, but we're doing better in that regard. What happened is that we exposed a generation to heroin. Once they were unable to get their prescription opioids, they went to heroin on the street, and it was a lot cheaper. And that was the second phase of this epidemic. We're currently in the third phase, which is the deadliest phase of all. And that phase is with synthetic opioids, very high potent opioids that one use could lead to death. One use when you relapse can lead to death. And that's what's at stake here. And you can see the statistics up here. Relapse to opioids is over 70% if they just receive detox. 91% of heroin users will relapse if they just receive detox. 60% of them will relapse within that first week. Why is that important? Well, only 11% of those that need treatment of an addiction actually get treatment. 11%. And of those 11%, only 50% get adequate treatment. So sadly, there's too many opioid use disorder patients that are getting detox only, and they're relapsing at alarming rates. And when they relapse, they're relapsing on very potent synthetic opioids that can kill them. So that's why the numbers keep going up. And it's a very powerful addiction. It has a stigma, a persona. There's associated risks of hepatitis C, HIV, and there's this delusional thinking about death. You would think that if a dealer has a spate of deaths in the product that they're selling, that people would stay away. But the truth is, if they have that spate of deaths, people flock to them, thinking that's the good stuff. I'll be all right. Those that died just didn't know what they were doing. I do. And it happens in counties all around Caron, where I work. So to understand how to prevent relapse, we have to understand a little bit about what's going on in the brain in the commission of active addiction. So what's happening in the limbic area of the brain is that there's a reward that's occurring, a reinforcement because of an increase in dopamine from their drug of choice. In this case, we're talking about opioids. And it's causing them to feel euphoric and a sense of pleasure. It's that area of the brain that we're targeting with our medications. That's reducing the cravings that they have, the triggers that they're experiencing, and they're able to kind of calm down and maybe sit down in treatment. And what's happening in the prefrontal cortex while someone is in active addiction is that it is not working efficiently. There's the ASAM model that Dr. Volkoff and Goldstein came up with that talks specifically about that. I won't get into all of that right now today. But what's happening is the prefrontal cortex is not functioning well when someone is in active addiction. But it's that area that we target when someone's in treatment. That's where biological methodology is second to psychotherapy, it's second to social therapy and social supports. That's where we're really targeting behavioral modification, support, 12-step supports. That area of the brain, prefrontal cortex, is a key area for us in treatment centers. So, why MAT? So the three types of MAT are methadone maintenance, buprenorphine maintenance, and naltrexone extended release or Vivitrol. They're the three MATs. MMT, which is methadone maintenance, was approved in 1972, buprenorphine maintenance in 2002, and extended release naltrexone in 2010. So what is medication-assisted treatment? It's counseling, behavioral therapies, and supportive services with medicine to alleviate, manage cravings, and reduce the risk of relapse. Much like other chronic diseases, we're using medications with other strategies to give someone the best chance of remission. And it's really a difficult task with opioids regarding relapse prevention because cravings are so intense with them and they last for so long, beyond other drugs, that we really have our work cut out for us. So it's really important that we get medication-assisted treatment started and begin the psychosocial therapies, the behavioral modification while they're in treatment. And this is a study showing just that. You can see in this study here from Baltimore, where I spent a good hour in traffic today, you can see that as they used more and more buprenorphine maintenance, more and more methadone maintenance, you saw a decrease in heroin overdoses. So that's a simple correlation. The next study is from Mass Health, and it's a very large study looking at buprenorphine maintenance, methadone maintenance, and just behavioral health therapies. And what you see in the green is no MAT, just behavioral health therapies, and you see that there's a lot of relapsing going on. In the other groups, buprenorphine and the methadone maintenance, there is a low degree of relapse. So this, to us as clinicians, says we need to use this medication and we need to make sure that it's inculcated in our treatment strategies. But as Dr. Clark said, that's not happening, unfortunately. MAT also manages post-acute withdrawal and even acute withdrawal. And this is just a timeline of both. You can see that acute withdrawal is over in about a week. It's a withdrawal that's not going to kill you, but you wish you were dead. That's what patients tell us, at least. And post-acute withdrawal can go on for quite a long time, weeks, maybe even months and years. And MAT can help with that. You can get someone on buprenorphine maintenance or methadone maintenance and really alleviate their post-acute withdrawal. And all this is very important because we have certain targets that are very important that science has told us we need to shoot for. So it takes about a year for relapse to be less likely than recovery. And it takes 5 years for someone to have the same prevalence of addiction as the general population. So this is a treatable disease. So someone who has an opioid use disorder, if we can get them to 5 years, their prognosis is excellent. So who supports MAT? Everybody. Who's using MAT? Not enough people. So this map shows what Dr. Clark was mentioning, which is the fact that most states are not utilizing MAT the way they should. The green is not for marijuana, I just want to be clear. The green is for low utilization, red is for high utilization. And you can see there's only a few states that are actually using MAT the way it should be used, which is high utilization. So let's talk about marijuana, specifically about the treatment of opioid use disorder. So Dr. Clark mentioned, she actually quoted the numbers, that in the National Survey of Drug Use and Health in 2017, that 4.1 million persons met the criteria for a marijuana use disorder. and only 2.1 met the criteria for an opioid use disorder. So this is an addictive substance, so we have to tread carefully over this. And marijuana is addictive, we know that at Caron, because 92% of our adolescents report marijuana as a drug of choice in treatment, 92%. And 13% of our opioid use disorder patients report marijuana as a drug of choice as well. So as been mentioned all along, it's really important to have evidence guidance. So on the left are the FDA-approved MAT strategies: methadone maintenance, buprenorphine maintenance, and extended release naltrexone. And what the FDA has given us is indications, uses, efficacy, safety, dosages, mode of action, method of administration, adverse reactions, drug interactions, and warnings. These are things that I sit down with my patients and talk to them about, because it's real important that I get informed consent. I want the patient to help me pick their MAT strategy, and I gotta tell them why it works, how it works, and what are the possible side effects that they may experience, and they help me together pick the best MAT choice. On the other side, you can see that marijuana is not indicated as MAT for opioid use disorder. I can't have that talk with the patient. I can't get informed consent from the patient. And there's no consistency or standardization as a result. So FDA is very rigorous in how they do things. Clinical trials are well designed and monitored. There's too many questions when it comes to marijuana. Most of the evidence, as we heard already, it's anecdotal. There's some epidemiological studies that Dr. Humphreys talked about. But we've been here before. Again, Dr. Humphreys mentioned about heroin being the cure for the morphine epidemic post-Civil War. And the truth is, why take a risk? We have medicines that work that we're not using enough. Why choose a medicine that we don't know enough about? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garbely. Dr. Madras.
There's somebody sitting near that window and just looking, because the contrast on the screen is very.
Just with the white cord.
Is that chain?
Excuse me. Can you hear the presentation? This presentation was Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. It's a delight to be here with such luminaries. The opioid crisis and the commission report, Can Marijuana Be a Solution? I'd like just to give a shout out to Paul Larkin, who's sitting in the back, because he helped really establish the report, in which I'm going to describe to some extent.
Yeah, I think you have to be in the presentation.
No, the presentation mode is killing it. It's going to get it. All the animations disappear in the presentation. I'll try. So, the ancient Greeks had a term called Pharmacon. And Pharmacon means a poison and a medicine. And I don't think there's a more apt term that we can apply to opioids. There's no other drug, I think, that fulfills this to such an accurate extent. And the reason is that it can produce both pleasure and pain. And both pleasure and pain is regulated by the opioid system in our brains. Pain is the #1 reported medical reason for using abusable drugs. And because the pleasure and pain centers are linked, it makes an awful lot of sense that if you're going to dampen pain, there's also the possibility of overshooting and increasing your pleasurable state. From 1900 on, most accidental deaths in our country declined. The deaths due to falls, the deaths due to fires, the deaths due to drownings, the deaths due to poison gas, all of them fell dramatically over 100 years. The only one that hasn't is the death due to drugs. And that has risen dramatically in the past 15, 20 years or so. And we've already seen the slide showing that the greatest cause of overdose deaths now is fentanyl, followed by heroin, prescription opioids, cocaine, and methamphetamine. So today, what I'm going to try to summarize in 5 seconds is the opioid crisis and the root causes. Why are the root causes so important? There are 2 motivations for going after these root causes. One is to try to understand how our country got into this mess in order to reverse engineering the mess. Because there's certain things we can take steps to reverse, which and to take those steps, we have to understand what they are. And secondly, the mess we're in with opioids has many parallels with marijuana. And it's very interesting to look at the strategies and tactics that were used in terms of advancing the use of opioids and see whether or not they're applicable to marijuana as well. I'll quickly go through the opioid recommendations, the Opioid Commission recommendations, a bit on marijuana and pain, and then finally close with, can marijuana substitute for pain? Let's take a look at the root causes. How many in this room are aware that we had a terrible opioid addiction problem in our nation 200 years ago? Anyone? A few. Not many. The majority of people who were addicted were women after the Civil War. Men ramped up the problem as well because of the injectable morphine that was developed. But what was so interesting is that in the austere and revered New England Journal of Medicine, which is a paragon of medical journalism, in 1823 and 1825, there were 2 articles written by physicians, one of which tried to surmount an overdose by developing a hose that could go into the stomach and suck out the contents of opioids, morphine, laudanum, opium juice. So we knew 200 years ago that this drug class can kill you. And another physician tried to surmount the overdose crisis, the overdose treachery, by giving vinegar, acetic acid, to make a person vomit the contents of their stomach. So for over 100 years, the medical community knew that opioids are addictive, they can cause overdose, and there was no evidence for the use in chronic pain. In fact, the evidence was the reverse, that it's malevolent because so many people became addicted to morphine. And then what happened? In the same revered New England Journal of Medicine, fast forward now to 1980, there was a 5-sentence letter to the editor saying addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. And they said they conclude, despite widespread use of narcotics in hospitals, it's rare. Now, I gave this 5-sentence letter on this slide to first-year Harvard Medical School students just a few months ago. And I said, I'm going to do a cold call on you. You tell me what's wrong with this. And in 5 minutes, they had all the weaknesses of this 5-sentence letter. But what they didn't know was that after this was published in 1980, the letter garnered 600 citations in the biomedical journals. 600. Letters usually get no more than 10, which meant a whole group of people publishing in medical journals were affirming the conclusions, because most of the conclusions, the evidence was weak and the pressure was on. Shifting the blame of pain to physicians, there were 2 very large lawsuits that were well publicized. A patient movement began, the tragedy of needless pain. The pharmaceutical industry put in millions upon millions of dollars to so-called educate pain societies, patient advocacy groups, and medical societies on how opioids are effective and safe for the treatment of chronic pain. And that little letter helped to catalyze, because there was the evidence. This is New England Journal of Medicine. Doctors were were visited by detailers, by marketing men. The Veterans Administration adopted pain as the fifth vital sign. The Joint Commission that accredits healthcare organizations followed suit. And soon the pressure was on physicians. Assess pain, treat pain aggressively to the satisfaction of patients. Otherwise, you may lose your accreditation and your reimbursement. And then the cartels noticed, and they started to produce heroin with much higher purity and at much lower price. And so when prescriptions started to tighten, when tamper-resistant medications were developed in a subpopulation of people, we saw a shift to heroin and to illicit market drugs. With the advent of fentanyl, which started in 2013, this is a 2 kilogram, at 1 kilogram, it's 2.2 pounds of fentanyl, can kill 500,000 people. This is the size of a 2 kilogram box of sugar. We had a perfect storm. And so the President's Commission was formed with 3 governors, an Attorney General, former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, and this little old lady who bought 4-inch heels to try to elevate her status in the committee. But in any case, Governor Christie asked me to shepherd the report, and the commission response looked at every single phase of this problem. From prevention, which includes supply reduction, to risk factors, how people initiate, escalate, how they overdose, how they develop an opioid use disorder, withdrawal, relapse, and all that, and the impact on families and children, on people in the criminal justice system, on college campuses. 56 recommendations emerged from it, which included broad brushstrokes of prevention, recovery, treatment, rescue, research, who would do it, and accountability. And these are some of the topics in terms of federal funding, removing treatment barriers, and of course, when I studied the history in depth, reverse engineering some of the folly, the mishaps in the healthcare community. And all of these, there are about 36 recommendations that are efforts to reverse engineer the root causes of this. The commission report included solutions for treatment, which you've heard enough about, but we did include data analytics, which is critical, research as well. And then we get to the nexus between marijuana and opioids. And we'll go through this very quickly. George Washington died of a terrible, terrible infection. He was bled, half his blood volume, and it probably accelerated his demise. And the reason he was bled half his blood volume is that there were no randomized controlled trials that were objective, evidence-based, to determine if bloodletting, which had been going on for thousands of years, ancient Egyptians, ancient Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, the Middle Ages, everyone decided that if you want to treat someone, you just drain their blood out of them, because the blood is the root cause of these problems. So randomized controlled trials have become the gold standard of how you assess medications. And if you look at the indications for marijuana as a medicine in these states, Illinois is by far the poster child for it. These have no randomized controlled trials for smoked marijuana, with the exception of neuropathic pain and a study on multiple sclerosis. Somehow we have taken that step backwards to the time of George Washington. So there are rationales for using marijuana in the opioid crisis. Cannabinoids in the plant have been approved by the FDA. There are CB1 cannabinoid receptors distributed in brain regions associated with pain processing. Smoked marijuana in some randomized controlled trials showed pain reduction, largely neuropathic pain. There are 4 studies that with small groups, so there's lots of weaknesses in those studies, and that marijuana is safer than opioids, and that marijuana will rescue our country. What's the rationale against using marijuana? Is it a safe and effective analgesic? Do states with legal or medical marijuana have lower opioid overdose rates? Do users of marijuana for pain use less opioids? Does marijuana use interfere with treatment for opioid use disorder? And what does the preclinical research tell us? The evidence for marijuana as an analgesic in neuropathic pain, which is one subtype of pain. There are many different types of pain, there's many different degrees of pain, and there's psychogenic pain. There's so many that we can discuss. I had a whole slide on pain, and I said, Kevin will take the hook on me. So what we know is that the concentration of marijuana is not fixed. The ratio of THC to CBD is not uniform. It's not been tested adequately in various forms of pain, and especially in chronic pain. Those randomized controlled trials, none of them lasted more than a couple of weeks. Same situation we had with opioids. At the time that I was worried about opioids in 2006, I looked at the literature. We had nothing past a few months, no data. And it's not tested for chronic pain over months, not tested in terms of its effect on quality of life, daily living, cognitive function, etc. And the amazing thing is that THC and cannabidiol differ so markedly in terms of their pharmacological effects. One is addictive, the other is not. One intoxicates, the other does not. One impairs cognition, the other does not. One induces anxiety, the other does not. One is psychotomimetic, means it can induce psychosis, the other does not. One can be proconvulsant or anticonvulsant, the other is largely anticonvulsant. The receptors, the targets in the brain are quite different. And yet, the ratio of THC to CBD has gone up to 80 to 1 now. From 1 to 1, 3 to 1, 10 to 1. So the plan formed has none of the criteria that are used to improve a medicine. There's no standard dosing, and marijuana is not benign. Is it safe as an analgesic? Brain changes, addiction, cognitive deficits, amotivation, psychosis, and safety. All of these issues have a good solid base in terms of evidence behind them. That doesn't mean everyone is going to have these issues, but there is a vulnerability in some individuals that marijuana can precipitate. The prevalence of cannabis use disorder is somewhere between 11 and 30%. Wilson Compton says one death is seen, says 30%. Youth marijuana use is associated with much higher use of illicit drugs. And the latest is that, this is from NISDA data, that heavy users of marijuana in the 12 to 17-year-old range are 10 times more likely to misuse opioids. They're also much more likely to have depression, and these increases in risk also include the 18 to 25-year-olds. Overdose death rates increase dramatically in states that legalize marijuana. And what we have now is that states that have legalized or medicalized overdose deaths are 56% higher than states that have not touched the drug. Do users of marijuana for pain use fewer opioids? We've already seen some of the data, so I won't perseverate. Does marijuana use interfere with treatment for opioid use disorder? There's some evidence for that. What does the preclinical data tell us? Sometimes animal studies can give us insights that are unethical to conduct in humans. In humans, we know that young adolescent marijuana users use heroin and other drugs more. That data is pretty incontrovertible. Rodent adolescents exposed to THC seek heroin more avidly. Rodents exposed to THC in utero, when they grow up, they seek heroin more avidly, and their behavioral and brain structure and molecular biology is different. And future parents exposed to THC long before conception, long before pregnancy, they seek heroin more compulsively, they have more heroin withdrawal, and they also show brain and behavioral changes. I won't get into this because the hook is on the way, and I will just say, then it was over the commission report, we learned vast sums of money were spent to promote the opioids. Same thing with marijuana. Promoted for many medical conditions. Same for marijuana. Promoted as safe and non-addictive. Same for marijuana. No scientific evidence for chronic use. Same for marijuana. Advocates received attention, but opponents did not. Advocates were far more vocal. Addiction and diversion were not anticipated. High-potency drugs flooded the nation, and medical education lagged far behind. And government regulations failed to protect the public. The movement is parallel with marijuana. And I'm just closing. I'd like to say we've seen Prince perish, we've seen Michael Jackson. Many of these have succumbed to opioids. Entertainers, we lament, the media laments, but alas for those who never sing and die with all the music in them. Weep for the voiceless who have known the cross without the crown of glory. Thank you.
Great, well thank you Dr. Madras for that. It's sort of an embarrassment of riches here. I don't know if you all realize the minds of addiction solving this problem in this small room. It's really humbling for us, and we're really excited that you're here witnessing this. I think it's historic. I'm going to summarize and end since I don't think many people have left, so you're going to forego your lunch for a few minutes. I don't want to get in between you and food, it's always a bad thing. But let me end with a few minutes, a sort of summary of some of the things we heard about today. We've heard the claims that have been made by the marijuana industry. This one's one of my favorite billboards, brought to us by our scientific friends at Weed Maps, that says states that legalized marijuana had 25% fewer opioid-related deaths. That was the famous JAMA article that got a lot of traction. And I think actually Keith was the one who told me this, so we decided to put this on the billboard instead. That's about as logical as saying states with ice cream eaters had 25% more drowning deaths, which is also a true statistic. But that statistic is true. Why? Not because ice cream caused drowning, which is what they're trying to purport here, that legalized marijuana caused fewer deaths, but that people are eating ice cream in warm states, and warm states happen to have pools. And states with more pools happen to have more drowning and more swimming. So this is the kind of sort of fallacy in logic that I think we have to look out for. In that JAMA study in 2014, there were a lot of problems. I think Keith listed a lot of those. One of the interesting things that I found, there's some unpublished data, and it's actually coming out. You may remember this briefing not only for the great words of wisdom and data that you just heard of, but I'm going to introduce you to something that you may not have heard of. This is a book coming out in January that I think is going to be the most important book in the marijuana issue that we've seen in modern times. I know that's a very and I wrote a few books, so I'm saying, I'm biased to say that isn't the case, but I think this will be. It's called Tell Your Children, and it's being released in January of 2019 by an award-winning New York Times writer. Somebody who came into this being pro-marijuana various reasons, I'll save you some of the details which you can read, ended up publishing the most damning report on marijuana and mental illness that I've ever read. I was lucky enough to get an advanced review copy the other day. It'll be out in January. One of the things that Alex did is take the data from the JAMA article and look at the data from 2010 onward. And what he found from 2010 onward was that even using the methods that they used in that JAMA report, which were kind of flawed, he found the correlation to totally disappear, the correlation of opioids leading in medical marijuana states being lower. Some other articles that have come out that were not talked about today, the Journal of Opioid Management also tried to replicate the JAMA article and actually found that medical marijuana laws were associated with a 22% increase in age-adjusted opioid mortality. And then, of course, Keith read that addiction editorial where they said that the connection was very, very weak. Another article that we should remember is the big Lancet study that came out this last year, which started with 1,500 patients, people who were using opioids. And they ended up finding out, much to their surprise, based on the JAMA article, that there was no evidence that marijuana improved outcomes. And actually, marijuana users had greater pain, which was interesting, than non-users. And they also found that there was no evidence of a reduction in opioid, of using and misusing opioids, which confirms, and this was Keith's study that he referred to earlier that he got published in the Journal of Addiction Medicine, finding that actually marijuana users were more likely to use prescription drugs medically and non-medically, which I think was also very important. We heard from Dr. Madras about the NISDA data, which is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, showing an increase from marijuana users to opioid users. This has also been shown, and this was shown in the American Journal of Psychiatry as well. So it's being confirmed over multiple data sets. And just yesterday, and we just had to switch these slides up, in JAMA Internal Medicine, there was a letter published showing that the opioid crisis appears to be worsening wherever marijuana has been legalized. So we have a one-pager out here. I'm not going to go through all of this. There's a lot of data here and a lot of different things that have gone on. I did want to just show quickly what the opioid death rate in the first state to legalize marijuana is. That's obviously an increase, which doesn't necessarily prove that that's the reason that there's an increase. I'm certainly not saying that. But this idea that we are seeing these reductions in legalized states don't seem to be borne out by the data at all. Just as we end, a final reminder that when we talk about marijuana and medical marijuana, we're not, especially for the latter, we're not talking about people with terminal illnesses that frankly need anything that will help them for their last few months of life. That's really, I think when most of us are talking about medical marijuana, we're talking about this idea, like in Illinois and other states, where marijuana has been way over-recommended for any condition under the sun. And we're also not talking about this anymore. We're not talking about the 5% joint of THC. We're really talking about, here's we have that, but also this up here, the edibles and the other items that are being marketed towards young people. So one of the campaigns we had was called Are We Sure? That really it's not about peace and love anymore, that maybe it used to be. It's much more about dollars and cents and the commercialization. And one thing, I'm not sure how many of you knew this, but we now know that the former head of Purdue Pharma, who produced OxyContin and actually wrote the playbook for distributing OxyContin, especially in Appalachia, which is of course where the prescription opioid epidemic started, rural white population, that person is now actually the head of a medical marijuana company, doing the same thing over again. And if this isn't really evidence of what we're talking about with the commercialization, I don't know what is. The person used to grace these halls many times in anti-marijuana when given the stock option and given other things, was very proud to join the industry as well. So we really do see that what we're talking about here and how we're really talking about something that is for profit. To echo some of the, I love hearing the history today, but to echo some of the history, I'm going to make one other historical analogy, which is that we feel like we're living in 1918 rather than 2018, but 1918 for tobacco. 1918 for tobacco was a time when, we've had tobacco in our history for thousands of years. It's been used for that for a long time. We have not ever had the level of tobacco-related deaths we had until big tobacco started in the early part of the last century. Tobacco was used in various ways, never in the 20th century invention called a cigarette, never combined with nicotine, ammonia, and hundreds of other chemicals that the industry put into that. And we certainly didn't have the medical community and people of stature before the last century recommend these products. And of course, here we have what happened with tobacco. We feel like we're there right now, 100 years later, but for marijuana. A drug that may have been relatively benign at some point with low THC, that has been manufactured by a for-profit industry to be deadly and to be harmful, and certainly be related to things like psychosis, suicide, schizophrenia, and on and on. So we feel like we're back at that era, and it's really our duty to get the word out. One final statistic that I did want to share that we were very worried about, which is we're seeing a growing trend of medical marijuana and marijuana stores recommend marijuana to vulnerable populations. So it's one thing you're recommending it to a 30-year-old with a little bit of back pain that probably doesn't need it. It's a very different thing, though, to recommend it to a pregnant woman in her first trimester for nausea. And what Denver Health did was brilliant. It's amazing that it came out of Colorado. Was the researchers went undercover. They called 600-700 medical and legal marijuana stores and found that in total 70% of them told them that actually recommended this to pregnant women, and only 30% even said you should also check that with your doctor. Most of them didn't say that. And this is really, I think, an unintended consequence of what happens when medicine is in the hands of only sort of for-profit marketeers and not in the hands of scientists. We realize that several states have contradicted the Controlled Substances Act and decided to try their luck and legalize marijuana. I hope nobody in this city is paying attention. And for those states, we don't have our heads in the sand. We do think there are reforms that should be made. We feel like edibles and THC concentrations should be outlawed or severely restricted. Washington State, thanks to a lot of advocacy and a lot of sweat, is on the brink, maybe, of banning certain edibles and gummies and things. They're getting a lot of pushback. We'll see if it happens. We don't think the marijuana industry should serve on rule-making bodies to determine regulations. Right now, in over half the states that have had lax marijuana laws, the majority control of regulation is actually by the marijuana industry. We would never have Philip Morris have a majority control over tobacco control, or the alcohol industry have a majority control over what we're doing with alcohol. Yet we're seeing this with marijuana. We think advertising and promotion should be prohibited, although we realize there's a First Amendment problem with prohibiting commercial advertising, but we think we should push the envelope a little bit. But we really believe that Congress should implement a science-based awareness campaign on today's marijuana, and how parents can talk about it with their young people, but also just what parents should know themselves. Because many parents and baby boomers are reintroducing themselves to marijuana thinking it's legal, it's fine, and not realizing that this is very different than what they may have used 30 years ago. And we're continually concerned with drug driving. We support what NHTSA is doing in that area. We have a kind of campaign called Driving High Means DUI. You can go to highmeansdui.org. In states that have not legalized, we're all for removing criminal penalties, but we think at the end of the day, we want to try and discourage the use of substances. I mean, I think I was taught that it really comes down to whether you're doing policies that encourage a behavior or discourage a behavior. And we obviously think it should be discouraged, and that we need to work on many things. Here in Congress, we do support a number of medical marijuana research acts that are out there. Andy Harris has a bipartisan support for that. There's also the Meds Act, which would open up research. We do think research, as Dr. Humphreys said, should be opened up. We think it should be made easier to do. That is a much better answer. And if there are people who can't wait for that research, we had recommended to Congress a compassionate use program where if you truly do have 6 months to live, if you truly do have a child that is, although now we have Epidiolex for seizures, but before we had that, who's having multiple seizures a day that needs to try an experimental medication, that they should do so under a federally regulated and protected program, not under a state program that not only contradicts the CSA, but is also giving them God knows what, because the amount of contaminants and pesticides in legal programs when it should be regulated is pretty mind-boggling. And we think we should remove barriers to studying marijuana as a Schedule I drug. I wanted to end with a final word from our head, the NIH head for drugs, who's Dr. Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She said that repeated marijuana use during adolescence may result in long-lasting changes in brain function that can jeopardize educational, professional, and social achievements. However, the effects of a drug, legal or illegal, on individual health are not determined only by its pharmacologic properties, but also by its availability and social acceptability. In this respect, legal drugs offer a sobering perspective. So alcohol and tobacco offer a sobering perspective, accounting for the greatest burden of disease associated with drugs. Not because they're more dangerous than illegal ones. No one's saying a beer is more dangerous than heroin or a cigarette is more dangerous than meth. Nobody's saying that. But in terms of the burden to public health and safety, because so many more people use our legal, normal, commercialized drugs, the burden to society is much greater. So she ended, not because they are more dangerous, but because their legal status allows for more widespread exposure. So it's not so much what happens only at the individual level, but as also Keith was saying earlier, what happens at the aggregate is very important. And our legal drugs kill 8 times as many people as all illegal drugs combined. Not because alcohol is, more harmful than heroin or fentanyl, but because of the number of people using a commercialized product. We don't think we should step there and go there for a third drug that would be marketed. So I'm going to end here. Our website is learnaboutsam.org. We want to be a resource for all of you. Many of you know our Vice President of Government Affairs, Garth Van Meter, who really put this together, and I want to thank him and the SAM staff for putting this all together. And of course, I want to thank our incredible panel today as well, and thank all of you. We are way over our time, but that's okay. I think some of us will be able to stay for a few minutes for questions, and then we have planes and trains to catch. So thank you for coming.